All right, welcome back everybody for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty complex, the whole world of trade wars and tariffs, and then kind of tied in with that, the ambitions of some seriously powerful tech figures.
Yeah.
So the source we're using today is Trump's tariffs, trade wars, and economic turmoil. And we're going to be trying to figure out just how much influence these individuals have and, whether it's leading to positive change or just straight up chaos.
Right.
I mean, we've all heard about Trump's tariffs. We've all seen the headlines about these, tech billionaires. But are these actions ultimately beneficial or are they actually detrimental?
Yeah, that's the
Well,
question.
that's what we're here to figure out today. And get this, we're talking about real world impacts.
Absolutely.
So think about American soybean farmers feeling the squeeze from all this,
You,
or even the potential for an energy crisis. I mean, these are just a few of the unexpected consequences we'll be exploring today. Oh, and we can't forget about the whole subplot of the PayPal mafia vying for power and influence. Intrigued. I hope so.
oh, yeah,
Let's dive in.
absolutely. And, it's not just about the headlines here. It's about the real, the ripple effects these actions have on, everyday people like you.
Right?
Think about it. The prices you pay at the grocery store, the stability of your job, even like the potential for global instability. These are all connected to the decisions these powerful figures are making.
Okay, so let's start with Trump's approach to trade. I mean, the source kind of describes it as, using tariffs as a weapon, aiming for these winner-takes-all outcomes. Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah.
What exactly does a winner-takes-all outcome even look like when it comes to international trade?
Yeah, so it's a pretty aggressive strategy, that's for sure. Imagine a negotiation where one side is just determined to take everything off the table, leaving the other, with nothing. That's essentially a winner-takes-all approach, and it's definitely a departure from the more traditional collaborative approach to trade negotiations we've seen in the past.
Okay.
So Trump's tariffs on Colombian coffee, steel and aluminum from Canada and Mexico, and then those, escalating tariffs on China, those are all prime examples of this tactic in action.
And so is it working? I mean, the source kind of suggests that maybe not, and it even points to some unintended consequences. Like
Right.
China's trade surplus actually increased after the tariffs were imposed. How does that even happen?
Yeah, that's the thing about a globalized economy. It's incredibly complex and interconnected.
Yeah.
So when you try to isolate just one part of that system, it can have all these unexpected ripple effects elsewhere. And in this case, it seems like Chinese businesses, they kind of adapted. They found new markets. They became more efficient. So ultimately, they mitigated the impact of the tariffs.
So the tariffs were meant to kind of hurt China, but they actually ended up hurting American consumers
Mm,
because the source mentions that, American shoppers are now facing higher prices on everyday goods.
right, exactly. And remember, tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods. So when the cost of those goods goes up, businesses have to pass those costs on to someone.
Right.
And guess who that someone usually is? You got it. The consumer.
Right.
So it's like a domino effect. Higher tariffs lead to higher prices, which can then lead to reduced consumer spending and ultimately a drag on economic growth.
And the source doesn't paint a very pretty picture of the U.S. economy right now.
Right.
We're seeing this stock market correction, a slowdown in job growth, and there's all this talk about potential inflation. Are those all tied to this trade war?
Well, the source certainly suggests a strong connection. I mean, we're seeing hard data, like the drop of the S&P 500 index, and then, the ADP report indicating weaker job creation, all kind of classic signs of economic anxiety.
Mm.
All fueled by the uncertainty of this trade war.
Yeah.
Businesses are hesitant to invest, consumers are tightening their belts, and the overall mood is one of caution.
It's interesting that even though these tariffs were intended to boost American businesses, it seems like a lot of them are actually struggling. And the source specifically mentions American soybean farmers being hit particularly hard. What happened there?
Well, China was a major buyer of American soybeans.
Right.
And when the tariffs hit, China retaliated with tariffs of their own. So essentially, they shut off that market for American farmers.
Oh, wow.
And as a result, many farmers found themselves with this surplus of soybeans and no buyers,
Yeah.
which led to, financial hardship and uncertainty about the future.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that in a globalized world, there are always these unintended consequences.
Right.
And often it's the everyday people who end up bearing the brunt of these large-scale economic decisions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about, Trump's trade tactics and their impact on the U.S. economy. But the source also brings up another intriguing element, the role of tech billionaires in all of this.
Yeah, and the source refers to them as the PayPal Mafia.
The PayPal mafia. Okay.
You know, what's really interesting about that is they're not necessarily acting as this unified force.
Okay.
They all have these connections to Trump and a lot of influence within his administration, but each of them has their own ambitions and their own goals.
Gotcha.
So it's more like this complex web of alliances and rivalries,
Okay, right.
all kind of pushing their own agenda.
So we're not just talking about tech giants, we're talking about tech giants with political aspirations.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a whole other level of power and influence. So who are the key players here, and what are they hoping to accomplish? What are their goals?
Well, you got figures like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance, all wielding considerable influence within the Trump administration.
Okay.
Musk, for example, he is laser focused on his companies like SpaceX and Twitter and ambitions that go far beyond just making money.
Right.
He wants to revolutionize transportation, colonize Mars, even control the flow of information online.
Wow.
Yeah.
Talk about ambitious.
Yeah.
And what about Thiel? What's his game?
Thiel is, he's a fascinating character. He's known for his contrarian views and this real focus on cost-cutting and efficiency.
Okay.
He's been a really vocal advocate for reducing government spending and streamlining all that bureaucracy. He even brought in J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, to help implement some of his ideas.
So it sounds like they're aiming for a pretty significant overhaul of how the government operates. I mean, what are the potential consequences of their actions? Could this actually be beneficial, or are there risks involved in letting, these tech billionaires have so much influence over policy?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, they're bringing this fresh perspective and a willingness to challenge the status quo. They're not afraid to take risks and push boundaries, which could lead to innovation and positive change. Yeah. But on the other hand, there's a real concern about concentrating so much power in the hands of just a few individuals.
Right. I mean, we're talking about people who are used to operating in the, fast-paced, disruptive world of tech where change happens so quickly and the consequences aren't always fully considered. Could that approach backfire when applied to something as complex and delicate as government policy?
It's definitely a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
The source raises concerns about potential disruptions to government agencies, shifts national priorities, and even the possibility of further economic volatility.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And it remains to be seen whether the benefits will outweigh the risks.
So we've got Trump's trade wars creating chaos in the global market. And then we've got these, tech titans with their own agendas, potentially adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
It sounds like a recipe for, well, more chaos. So is any of this actually beneficial?
Right.
Or are we headed straight for disaster?
That's the question we're going to unpack further as we continue our deep dive here.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good.
It's interesting you use the word chaos because the source actually suggests that chaos can sometimes be a catalyst for innovation.
Okay.
Think about it. When things are shaken up, people are forced to adapt. They have to find new solutions. Think outside the box.
Okay. That's a pretty intriguing concept. So instead of fearing this chaos, maybe we should be embracing it. But is there any evidence that this disruption is actually leading to positive change?
Well, the source doesn't necessarily provide concrete examples, but it raises the possibility that, businesses facing uncertainty from the trade wars might be more inclined to invest in new technologies,
Right.
Streamline their operations, maybe explore new markets. It's like that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Makes sense. Makes sense. But even if there is potential for innovation, the source also acknowledges that the chaos hasn't exactly been a picnic for everyone.
Right.
I mean, we already talked about the impact on American soybean farmers, but what about, American consumers in general? How are they being affected?
Or remember those higher prices we talked about.
Yeah.
Those tariffs are directly impacting what you're paying for everyday goods.
Right.
And that can put a real strain on household budgets,
Mm.
lead to reduced spending, which can then, ripple through the entire economy.
It sounds like a bit of a catch-22. The tariffs are meant to protect American businesses and workers, but they're also hurting American consumers.
Right.
And potentially slowing down economic growth.
Exactly.
How do we balance those competing interests?
That's the real challenge, isn't it? And it's not just about the economic impact.
Right.
The source also raises concerns about the potential political consequences of all this chaos.
Okay.
It suggests that, when people feel like traditional systems are failing them, they often turn to these, like, strongmen, leaders, who promise stability and order, even if it comes at the expense of individual liberties.
That's a sobering thought. I mean, history is full of examples of, these charismatic leaders exploiting periods of uncertainty to kind of consolidate their power. Are we seeing a similar trend emerging today?
It's certainly something to be mindful of. The source doesn't necessarily make any specific predictions, but it encourages us to, be vigilant
Mm.
and to make sure that any pursuit of stability doesn't come at the cost of democratic values.
So let's get back to that central question then. Is the chaos that we're witnessing ultimately a force for good, or is this a recipe for disaster? It sounds like the answer isn't so simple.
Yeah, the source doesn't really offer a definitive conclusion. It presents both the potential benefits and the potential risks. And it really just encourages you, to weigh those factors and come to your own conclusions.
That's what's so great about these deep dives. It's not about us telling you what to think.
Right.
It's about giving you the information and the context you need to form your own, informed opinions.
Exactly. And it's not just about passive observation.
Yeah.
The source challenges us to be active participants, to ask tough questions and to hold our leaders accountable.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and let chaos dictate the future. We have to shape it.
Okay, so we've talked about, the broader economic and political implications of all this chaos, but let's zoom back in on those tech billionaires for a second.
Yeah.
The source refers to them as the PayPal mafia.
Right.
What's the story there?
It's fascinating, really. It's this group of incredibly successful entrepreneurs. Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, Max Levchin. They all got their start at PayPal back in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And since then, they've gone on to found and fund some of the most influential companies in the world.
So it's more than just a shared history. It's like a network of power and influence, but they're not all working together, right?
Right.
The source mentions that they often have these, competing interests.
Exactly. It's not like there's some kind of secret society with a master plan. They're just a group of highly ambitious individuals, each with their own vision for the future.
Right.
And a willingness to use their vast resources to achieve it. Sometimes they collaborate, sometimes they compete. It's a constantly evolving dynamic.
It seems like a high-stakes game of chess almost, with each player making these strategic moves to try and, outmaneuver the others.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And the source suggests that these tech titans aren't just playing for money. They're playing for power and influence with the goal of shaping the world according to their own ideals.
Can you give us some examples? Like, what are some of the specific ways that they're using their influence?
Well, take Elon Musk, for example. He's not just building electric cars and spaceships. He's also trying to revolutionize transportation with hyperloops, colonize Mars, control the flow of information with his acquisition of Twitter. He's using his wealth and his platform to really push for a future that, aligns with his own vision.
And what about Thiel? What are his priorities?
Keel is focused on a different set of goals. He's a big believer in the power of technology to solve problems and create efficiency.
Okay.
So he's been a major investor in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, all these other cutting-edge fields. And he's also been a very vocal advocate for reducing government regulation and promoting individual liberty.
So it sounds like they're both trying to shape the future, but just in very different ways.
Right.
Is that where the conflict comes in?
Absolutely. They have different priorities, different values,
Yeah.
different approaches to achieving their goals. And sometimes those differences lead to clashes both in the business world and the political arena.
It's like they're each playing their own game, but on the same board with the same pieces.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, but it's also a little bit unsettling. Are there any checks and balances in place to make sure that their power isn't abused?
That's a key question. The source raises concerns about the lack of transparency and accountability when it comes to the influence of these tech billionaires.
Right.
They're not elected officials, so they're not subject to the same kind of public scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
And their vast wealth gives them access to resources and influence that most people can only dream of.
Yeah, it sounds like a potential recipe for disaster. What can be done to ensure that their power is used responsibly?
That's something we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the impact of Trump's tariffs to the ambitions of this so-called PayPal mafia.
Mhm.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
I think one of the most important points that the source really highlights is just how interconnected our world really is.
Hmm.
What happens in one country or in one industry or even, with one individual can have these huge ripple effects across the globe. It's
Yeah.
like this giant web and every thread is connected.
Yeah, that's so true. And we've seen how, tariffs intended to punish China actually ended up impacting American consumers and farmers. And we've talked about how the actions of just a few tech billionaires could potentially reshape entire industries and even government. I mean, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is. And that brings me to another really crucial takeaway, the importance of critical thinking.
Right.
We live in this age of information overload. We're constantly bombarded with news and opinions and data.
Right.
It can be super overwhelming trying to sift through it all and figure out what's true, what's relevant, and what's, just noise.
Especially when you consider how much influence these tech billionaires have over the flow of information. I mean, they control social media platforms, news outlets, even like the algorithms that determine what we see online. It's more important now than ever to be able to think critically, to question what we're being told and to seek out diverse perspectives.
Exactly. And that's where this deep dive comes in. I mean, we're not just summarizing the source material here. We're analyzing it, we're questioning it, we're exploring the implications, we're encouraging you to think for yourself and come to your own conclusions.
Right, and speaking of conclusions, I think it's fair to say that the source doesn't really offer any easy answers here.
Right.
It kind of paints this complex and often contradictory picture of the world, leaving us with more questions than answers.
That's true, but I actually think that's a good thing. I mean, the world is messy and complicated, and any attempt to oversimplify it is just going to fall short.
Yeah.
It's better to just embrace that complexity, grapple with the nuances and acknowledge that there just aren't any easy solutions.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about these deep dives. They push us to think beyond the headlines, to really engage with complex issues, and to consider, the long-term implications of the choices that we make today.
Absolutely. But you mentioned earlier that the source focuses primarily on the actions of, Trump and the American tech elite. But as we wrap up here, I kind of want to challenge you and our listener to think about the bigger picture. What about the rest of the world? How might other countries react to this, kind of shifting landscape?
Hmm.
And what new alliances or rivalries might emerge?
That's a great question. I mean, we've seen how China has already pushed back against, Trump's tariffs. Could we see a more permanent shift away from like the US-led global order?
Mm.
Could we see the emergence of new economic blocs or new centers of power? I mean, even new ways of doing business.
It's definitely possible. I mean, the source, kind of hints at the potential for this global power shift. And I think it's something we all need to be paying attention to. The world is in a state of flux, and those, old rules, they may no longer apply.
So to our listener, we urge you to continue exploring this topic. Stay informed, stay curious, and keep asking those tough questions. The future is not predetermined. It's something we create together through our choices and our actions.
That's right. And as you navigate this complex and ever-changing world, just remember the key takeaways from this deep dive. Everything is interconnected, critical thinking is absolutely essential, and that future, well, it's ours to shape.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the world around us.